So I want you to picture a 75-year-old man out in the, absolute blistering heat of the 1930s American Southwest.
Oh, man. Just brutal conditions.
Right, just brutal. And he is doing heavy manual conservation labor for the federal government. But here's the thing. He isn't living in a military camp.
Which is what you'd expect, right?
Exactly. He isn't waking up to a bugle. He's definitely not wearing some standardized uniform. And when his shift ends, he just gets on his own horse, rides back to his own house, and sits down to have dinner with his grandchildren.
It completely flips the script on what we think we know.
It really does. Because if you think you know the story of the Great Depression's Civilian Conservation Corps, that famous image of young guys from the cities packed onto trains.
Right, shipped off to the deep woods to build trails.
Yeah, you basically need to forget all of that. Because during that exact same era, the federal government ran this massive, multi-million-dollar parallel operation that just broke every single rule in Washington's playbook.
It really is a piece of history that completely upends our understanding of New Deal relief. I mean, we are looking at a program that handed an unprecedented level of local control to Native American communities.
Which was basically unheard of at the time.
Oh, totally unheard of. It allowed them to choose the work, select the workers, and, like you mentioned with the grandfather, keep their families completely intact during a decade of just absolute economic freefall.
But, history is rarely that clean.
No, it never is.
Because while this incredibly empowering program was running, under the exact same federal leadership and under the exact same guise of quote-unquote conservation, the government was also systematically destroying the economy of the Navajo Nation.
Yeah, rebuilding and destroying.
Empowering and devastating, both happening simultaneously and driven by the exact same underlying philosophy. And that contradiction is the mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring the Indian Emergency Conservation Work Program, which later became known as the Civilian Conservation Corps Indian Division, or the CCC-ID.
And to unpack this, we are relying on a really fascinating stack of sources today. We have a detailed historical dossier that covers the origins of the program back in 1933.
Right. Getting into the real granular policy stuff.
Exactly. Plus, we are analyzing actual Bureau of Indian Affairs records. And that includes a contemporary magazine they launched specifically to document this program, which was called Indians at Work.
Which is a whole fascinating piece of propaganda in itself.
Oh, completely. It's government PR mixed with genuine firsthand accounts. We also have historical summaries and oral history perspectives that explicitly contrast this era of the broader Indian New Deal with the incredibly controversial Navajo livestock reduction.
Right.
And really, the core theme running through all of this material is this delicate, highly contradictory balance between genuine Native agency and persistent, unwavering federal paternalism.
Yeah, it's like headquarters finally letting the local branch make its own decisions, but only because headquarters wrote the menu of options.
Right.
Right? And they still hold the purse strings. Like, are they really in control?
Yeah, that is the perfect way to frame it.
And the guy standing right at the intersection of that agency and paternalism is John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs.
A very complicated figure.
Very. But before we get to him, we kind of need to understand the landscape he was stepping into. When we talk about the Great Depression, the immediate images for you are probably breadlines in New York, right? Or like factories closing down in Chicago after the 1929 crash.
Sure, the classic textbook images.
Right. But the sources point out that when Franklin D. Roosevelt's relief machine finally reached the reservations in 1933, the Great Depression was honestly just the latest disaster.
Yeah, it was just the final crushing weight layered on top of generations of systemic land loss and, frankly, engineered poverty.
Engineer's the right word for it.
To really understand why a completely separate relief program was required, we have to look at the mechanics of what was known as the allotment era, which basically dominated federal Indian policy for roughly 50 years before 1933.
Let's break down the mechanics of that allotment era, specifically the Dawes Act in 1887. Because it's often framed in older textbooks as an attempt to turn Native Americans into farmers, which, sounds relatively benign on paper.
Right, like they were just handing out plows and saying good luck.
Exactly. But functionally, it was a targeted economic weapon designed to fracture communal wealth. So how did allotment actually work on the ground?
The mechanism of it was devastatingly simple. So prior to the Dawes Act, reservation land was held communally by the tribe.
Like, as a whole.
Right. The federal government stepped in, surveyed that communal land, and then assigned individual parcels, usually about 160 acres, to a native head of household.
So they deliberately broke up the communal land base.
Yes. But here is the critical part. After those 160-acre parcels were assigned to the individuals, the federal government looked at whatever land was left over on the reservation and just declared it as surplus.
And that surplus land was immediately opened up for sale to non-native settlers, right? Railroads, logging companies.
Exactly. So overnight, you literally shrink the total land mass of the reservation by millions of acres.
Wow.
And the damage just compounds from there. By forcing communal, extended family agricultural practices onto these isolated single-family plots, the government destroyed all the traditional economies of scale.
Because they couldn't farm or ranch the way they used to?
Exactly. And furthermore, these new individual parcels were suddenly subject to state and local property taxes.
Oh, right.
So when native families who, remember, had just been stripped of their traditional livelihood and had virtually no access to cash economies, inevitably couldn't pay those taxes.
The land was foreclosed on.
Foreclosed on and sold to white buyers.
So you end up with a map that literally looks like a checkerboard. You've got a native-owned farm surrounded by 3 white-owned farms next to a railroad right-of-way next to another native-owned farm.
Exactly. Checkerboarding.
Which makes large-scale ranching or any kind of cohesive community planning mathematically and geographically impossible. You've just atomized the entire community.
You have engineered chronic poverty. I mean, by the time 1933 rolls around, many native communities had lost up to 90 million acres of land.
90 million.
Yeah, that's roughly 2/3 of the land they held in 1887. So the social structures were eroded, and the economic foundation was just in ruins.
So into this massive multi-generational crisis steps John Collier. FDR appoints him as Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1933. And he is a deeply complicated character.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources describe him as a reformer. He had spent significant time with the Pueblo communities in the Southwest, and he kind of observed their communal way of life.
And he really romanticized it, too.
He did. He came away with this strong belief that native cultures possess something vital, that modern industrialized American society had, lost to rampant individualism.
Right. He saw it as a corrective to modern capitalism, basically.
Yeah. And his stated goal was to reverse the forced assimilation of the allotment era.
Collier genuinely wanted to protect and revitalize those communal structures. So when FDR started rolling out his massive New Deal relief programs, specifically the Emergency Conservation Work Program, which became the famous Civilian Conservation Corps.
The CCC?
Right, the CCC. Collier immediately saw a lifeline. He lobbied aggressively to get this relief funding extended to reservation lands.
But applying the standard federal blueprint to the reservations was a logistical and cultural nightmare. Let's look at the mechanics of the regular CCC for a second.
Yeah.
It was practically a military operation.
It really was.
The whole mechanism for efficiency was taking unemployed, single men, strictly aged 18 to 25, packing them onto trains and moving them across the country. They lived in massive 200-man military-run camps, operated on the ground by the U.S. Army.
Yeah, they literally woke to bugles, ate in mess halls, and operated under this strict, rigid hierarchy.
And if you look at that model through the lens of Native history in the 1930s, the cultural blindness is just staggering.
It's horrific, frankly.
For decades, the federal government's primary interaction with Native youth had been the boarding school system, forcibly removing children from their homes, stripping them of their language, and placing them in distant, highly regimented, quasi-military institutions to assimilate them.
Right. So imagine the federal government arriving on a reservation in 1933 and saying, "Good news, we have a relief program to save your economy. We just need you to hand over your young men so we can ship them to a distant military-run camp."
It perfectly mimics the trauma of the boarding school era.
Exactly. Native leaders and BIA officials under Collier recognized immediately that this was profoundly objectionable.
Like non-starter.
Total non-starter. And beyond the deep cultural objections, the rigid mechanics of the Army model simply broke down on reservation geography. Well, the standard CCC relied on economies of scale. If you were going to build barracks, a mess hall, and bring in Army quartermasters for 200 men, you need a massive, concentrated project to justify that infrastructure.
Like cutting a major highway through a national park or something?
Right. But reservation conservation needs were entirely different. They were diffuse. A community might need a small well dug in one valley, a mile of fencing repaired 10 miles away, and maybe a small earth dam built in another canyon.
You can't march a centralized battalion of 200 men 50 miles every single day to do small, scattered projects. It's just a logistical failure.
Recognizing this, Collier goes to FDR. And in the spring and summer of 1933, they draft a completely separate blueprint.
Okay.
FDR signs Executive Order 6147, which authorizes conservation work specifically upon Indian reservations, with an initial appropriation of roughly $5.875 million.
Which was a huge amount of money then.
Massive. And the foundational structural difference of this order is that the U.S. Army is entirely cut out of the loop.
Which is wild. This is where I have to look at the broader context of the 1930s federal government. Because the New Deal was obsessed with standardization.
No, they loved their alphabetical agencies and centralized rules.
They loved centralization. They loved creating massive federal bureaucracies that treated every single county in America exactly the same way to ensure absolute efficiency. So how does John Collier convince the Roosevelt administration to fund an entirely separate decentralized bureaucracy just for Indian country?
It really comes down to bureaucratic self-preservation and the unique legal status of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA was already this entrenched, separate bureaucratic universe within the Department of the Interior.
Like a government within a government.
Exactly. It had its own superintendents, its own jurisdictional treaties, its own complex relationship with federal trust land.
So Collier basically makes a jurisdictional argument. He tells Washington, if you try to overlay the Army's brand new CCC bureaucracy on top of our existing BIA bureaucracy on sovereign treaty land, the red tape will strangle the program before a single shovel hits the dirt.
Precisely. He argued that the BIA was the only federal entity legally and logistically equipped to navigate reservation jurisdiction. It was this rare historical moment where the territorial nature of federal agencies inadvertently aligned with a genuinely better policy outcome for the communities involved.
That is so rare. So they secure this parallel program, the BIA is running it. Now we need to look at what this actually meant for the people on the ground. Because the granular day-to-day differences between the regular CCC and the CCC Indian Division are staggering, especially when you look at who was actually allowed to work.
The demographic shift between the two programs reveals entirely different philosophies of relief. As we noted, the regular CCC strictly capped participation to young, unmarried men between 18 and 25.
Right.
The core philosophy there was partly about removing idle, potentially restless youth from struggling urban centers.
Getting them out of the cities. But in the Indian Division, they threw those age restrictions completely out the window.
Totally gone.
Married men were eligible, and crucially, elders were eligible. There was no upper age limit at all.
Which completely changed the dynamic.
Yeah, the data points from the BIA records illustrate this beautifully. In 1940, the Northern Cheyenne Agency reported that the average age of their enrollees was 34.
Average age of 34.
Right. You have men in their late 30s and 40s doing this heavy conservation labor.
It goes even further than that. By 1942, the United Pueblos Agency counted 172 enrollees over the age of 35. And among them, they had 3 men who were 75 years old actively participating in the program.
When you see a 75-year-old man enrolled in a manual labor relief program, it immediately tells you this isn't some youth employment scheme. This is a mechanism for sheer community survival.
And it is also a profound reflection of cultural mechanics. In many Native communities, elders hold the traditional roles of leadership, provision, and guidance.
Right.
If the program had only employed 18-year-olds, it would have artificially inverted the social hierarchy. It would have given young, unmarried men all the economic power while the elders were forced to rely on handouts.
Oh, wow. You hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. By allowing older men to work, the Indian Division allowed them to maintain their dignity and their role as active providers during a devastating crisis.
And the way those wages integrated into the community was completely different, too. In the regular CCC, a young man earned a base wage of $30 a month. But the mechanism of that payment was heavily centralized.
Yeah, they rarely saw that full amount.
Exactly. Usually, $25 was automatically deducted by the government and mailed directly to the young man's parents back in the city, leaving him with like $5 for incidental expenses at the canteen.
Because the federal government was treating those young men as dependents of a distant household.
Right. But in the Indian Division, the government recognized the enrollees as the heads of their local households. The wage structure was fundamentally adaptable to local realities.
Let's look at those specific wage benefits, because they directly incentivize local economic growth. An enrollee could earn their base wage, but the sources show they could earn an extra $1 or $2 a day just for supplying their own horse or their own team of mules for the project.
That is a massive injection of capital. It meant the federal government was renting local assets rather than, importing Army-heavy machinery.
Exactly. It kept the equipment budget circulating within the reservation economy.
And because they weren't building massive military barracks, the daily living arrangements completely reshaped the experience of labor. If a project was close enough, Native enrollees simply commuted.
Just treated it like a regular day job.
Yeah, they woke up in their own homes, traveled to the work site, and went home at night. And if a project was too far for a daily commute, the BIA and the tribes adapted the camp model.
Right. Instead of a 200-man barrack, a tribal council might authorize the construction of small bunkhouses for the single men. Or, incredibly, they utilized family tents.
This blew my mind when I read about it.
It's so unique. If a married man was assigned to build a stretch of road or a dam a few days' ride from his village, he could bring his entire household, his wife, his children, to live in these family tents near the work site.
Furthermore, if the BIA didn't provide a camp at all, the enrollee received a room and board allowance added to their paycheck. And there were no curfews. Enrollees were completely free to leave camp when their shift ended.
If we synthesize all these granular details, the lack of age caps, the commuting, the family tents, the horse rentals, we see a program that was fundamentally engineered to preserve family stability.
Absolutely.
The regular CCC, by its very design, severed young men geographically from their communities. The Indian Division allowed men to fulfill their traditional roles as providers without leaving their homelands. During a decade where economic desperation was tearing families apart all across America, forcing men to ride the rails looking for work, this structure kept Native families intact.
It's basically the difference between being drafted into a military unit versus securing a well-paying local union job.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If you're drafted, you're told where to go, what to wear, and your family gets an allotment check while you're gone. But if you get a local union job, you're doing hard labor, sure, but you sleep in your own bed, you maintain your own tools, and you watch your kids grow up. It is a completely different psychological experience of work.
That distinction naturally leads us to the question of management. If you have this older, localized workforce that knows the terrain intimately, the obvious question becomes, who is actually managing them?
Right.
If the BIA isn't handing them a standardized federal blueprint drafted in Washington, who decides what work needs to be done on a Tuesday morning?
And this brings us to an unprecedented shift in power, the role of the tribal councils. In the regular CCC, the Department of Labor and the Army chose the enrollees, and federal agencies like the Forestry Service chose the projects.
All top-down.
Very top-down. But in the Indian Division, local tribal leaders selected the workers. They looked at their own communities, determined who needed the income most desperately, and hired them. And more importantly, the tribal councils selected the projects.
This represents a degree of local self-administration that was almost entirely unheard of in the federal-Indian relationship at that time. For decades, federal Indian agents had dictated every aspect of reservation life, literally down to what crops individuals were allowed to plant.
Micromanagement at its worst.
Exactly. So handing the power of project selection to tribal councils meant that the conservation work actually aligned with local immediate bottlenecks.
The mechanism of local knowledge is so crucial here. If you are a bureaucrat sitting in Washington, you might look at a map and say, oh, plant trees here.
Right, because it looks good on the map.
Exactly. But if you are a local tribal council, you know that the South Pasture floods every spring and ruins the grazing. You know that a specific isolated village desperately needs a new well because their water source dried up. You know exactly where a truck trail needs to be cut to safely get timber down from the mountain before winter. By putting the choice in local hands, the economic and infrastructural outcomes dramatically improved.
The BIA's role was theoretically reduced, supplying just the technical assistance, the civil engineers, the hydrologists, the agronomists, to help execute the council's vision. And we see how fiercely some communities guarded this newfound agency.
Oh, this story in the dossier is amazing.
It is. It highlights a remarkable event involving the Santo Domingo Pueblo in New Mexico.
This event perfectly illustrates the collision of federal bureaucracy and local cultural authority. So, to join any federal work program in the 1930s, there were rigid bureaucratic prerequisites. One of them was a mandatory comprehensive physical examination by a federal doctor to ensure the enrollee was fit for hard labor.
standard federal policy, but the leaders of the Santo Domingo Pueblo flat out refused the physical exams.
They just said no.
They said no. They stated that the specific requirements of the federal medical examinations violated their tribal rules and cultural practices regarding bodily modesty and privacy.
Now, in the standard federal machinery of the New Deal, refusing a mandatory regulation would immediately disqualify your entire community from the program.
Usually, the federal government did not bend to local cultural preferences, like, at all.
Yet, astoundingly, the federal government backed down here. The BIA actually waived the mandatory physicals for the Santo Domingo Pueblo enrollees. They essentially conceded that the local leaders understood the fitness of their own people better than a standardized federal medical form. It was a massive, unprecedented win for Native agency.
It really was.
But wait, let's pause on the Santo Domingo Pueblo story for a second. Because, sure, the BIA waiving a medical requirement sounds like a massive win for agency. But isn't this autonomy incredibly fragile?
How do you mean?
Well, we established that the BIA was running the overarching program. So if Washington is still holding the purse strings, aren't these tribal councils just operating within an invisible fence? Like, if a council proposed a project that the federal engineers deemed inefficient, couldn't the BIA just refuse to release the funds? The second a tribe steps out of line with what federal scientists want, doesn't that agency just vanish?
You are identifying the exact tension at the heart of the entire Indian New Deal. It was bounded autonomy.
Bounded autonomy.
It's like a parent giving a teenager a credit card for emergencies only. But the parent retains the absolute right to define what constitutes an emergency after the card is swiped.
That's a great way to put it.
The tribal councils had a menu of options to choose from, but Washington wrote the menu. The BIA permitted self-administration only as long as the tribe's goals align with the broader federal goal of land conservation. When those goals diverged, as we will see a bit later, the illusion of complete autonomy evaporated.
But even within that invisible fence, they accomplished an extraordinary amount of physical work. We really need to look at the massive physical footprint they left behind, because to understand the labor, we have to look at the ecological mechanism of the Dust Bowl.
Right. The 1930s environmental crisis in the American West was catastrophic. Severe, prolonged drought had combined with decades of overgrazing and poor land management practices, often practices that were, by the way, forced upon Native communities during the allotment era.
Because they couldn't rotate the herds on those tiny 160-acre plots.
Exactly. And the mechanism of the disaster was the destruction of the root systems. Without deep-rooted grasses to hold the topsoil in place, the soil just dried to powder.
When the rare rains did come, they didn't soak in. They just washed over the hard-packed dirt, creating massive runoff. This water channeled into deep gullies, literally tearing the pastures apart and washing millions of tons of topsoil downstream.
So this wasn't just a landscaping beautification project.
No, it was a desperate, physical fight to save the earth from total collapse.
The sources list the immense scope of the labor utilized to fight this. Enrollees were building dams, laying down roads, cutting truck and pack trails through mountainous terrain. They were digging wells, stringing hundreds of miles of telephone lines for communication across vast reservations, building lookout towers, and even fighting massive wildfires.
Let's explain the specific mechanisms of some of these projects, because they weren't just moving dirt around to stay busy. Take the earth-fill dams, for instance. How does an earth dam stop topsoil erosion?
Well, a gully forms because water channels and accelerates, and the sheer velocity of the water acts like a knife, carving out the soil.
Right.
An earth-fill dam placed strategically across a gully acts as a brake. It slows the velocity of the runoff water during a storm. Because the water slows down, it loses the energy required to carry heavy sediment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so the suspended topsoil drops out of the water and settles behind the dam, slowly filling the gully back in over years. It literally catches the disappearing land.
That's brilliant. And what about the fencing? The records show they built hundreds of miles of fences to manage the range. Why is a fence a conservation tool?
It comes back to the mechanism of grazing. Sheep and cattle, when left unmanaged on a failing pasture, will eat the grass all the way down to the root, and the physical shearing action of their hooves will pull the surviving roots completely out of the dry dirt.
Which causes the Dust Bowl effect.
Exactly. So a massive grid of fencing allows tribal councils to enforce rotational grazing. You move the herds into one fence grid, let them graze the top layer of grass, and then move them to the next grid before they can damage the root structures.
Giving it time to recover.
Right. The fence gives the fragile Dust Bowl topsoil time to recover and reestablish a hold.
The economic impact of this highly localized, Highly strategic labor was immediate. The BIA records note that in Minnesota alone, over 2,000 Native families drew vital income from the CCC-ID. This was life-saving capital pouring into local businesses and kinship networks.
But the long-term benefit extended far beyond the immediate workly paycheck. We have to look at the skill building. The contemporary BIA magazine, Indians at Work, heavily documented this. Now we must approach this magazine as government PR.
Yeah, they were definitely actively trying to show Congress that the appropriations were yielding success stories.
For sure. But even so, the first-hand accounts reveal a genuine transfer of durable skills.
The oral histories and BIA profiles highlight this upward mobility. There's this story of a former Northern Cheyenne enrollee who saved enough of his CCC-ID wages to purchase his own stock truck.
Which was a massive deal back then.
Huge. By acquiring that piece of heavy machinery, he instantly transitioned from a laborer into a local entrepreneur, hauling goods for his community. Another enrollee utilized the advanced range management techniques he learned from federal agronomists to become a completely self-supporting stockman.
And we see industrial skills transferring as well. The sources detail an enrollee who learned advanced welding while repairing heavy machinery in the program. He took those skills off the reservation, moving to Washington State to work as an industrial welder, earning the incredibly high wage of $1.62 an hour.
$1.62 an hour during the Great Depression.
It was a small fortune. It represents profound economic mobility fueled directly by federal training.
While those individual stories are powerful, the collective success is still visible on the landscape today. Many of the structures built during this era, specifically those earth-filled dams, the access roads cutting through remote canyons, the developed natural springs that provide reliable water to livestock, and the fencing grids are still inactive, daily used by reservations right now, 90 years later.
That physical legacy basically validates the initial decision to let tribal councils select the projects. Because the local community chose the infrastructure based on their actual lived bottlenecks, they chose infrastructure that would serve them for generations rather than standardized federal busywork.
It makes me think of open source software infrastructure. The federal government provided the initial code base, the funding, the heavy machinery, the technical BIA engineers. But the local community took that raw code and built a custom operating system tailored exactly to their environments.
It's a really interesting way to look at it.
And because they built it themselves, they know how to maintain it, and they're still running that exact same software nearly a century later.
That is a highly effective way to conceptualize the durability of the program. However, this physical infrastructure wasn't built in a political vacuum. To truly grasp the significance of the CCC Indian Division, we have to pull back and look at how it functioned as the vanguard for John Collier's overarching political project.
Right, because the CCC-ID was just one piece of a massive legislative puzzle known as the Indian New Deal. And the centerpiece of Collier's entire tenure was passed in 1934. It was called the Indian Reorganization Act, or the Wheeler-Howard Act.
The Indian Reorganization Act is arguably one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in the history of federal Indian policy. Its primary function was to legally and officially end the disastrous policy of allotment that we discussed earlier.
Stopping the bleeding, basically.
Exactly. It halted the surveying of communal lands and actively sought to rebuild the tribal land base by returning unsold surplus lands to the tribes.
But the IRA went beyond just stopping the bleeding of land loss, right? It fundamentally attempted to rewire tribal governance. It actively encouraged tribes to form their own modern self-governments, to draft their own constitutions, and to incorporate as economic entities.
Collier's grand vision was to create politically sovereign, economically viable tribal nations that operated communally, protected from the predatory individualism of the outside market. And if you examine the daily operations of the CCC-ID, you see how it served as the vital proving ground for this grand vision.
It was a symbiotic relationship. The conservation work of the CCC-ID healed the physical land, stopping the erosion, building the dams, saving the topsoil. Meanwhile, the local management of the CCC-ID healed the political structure.
By having tribal councils manage the workforce, negotiate wages, and select the engineering projects, Collier was basically running a massive federally funded pilot program for the self-governance he was championing in the Indian Reorganization Act.
He was giving them the capital and the bureaucratic space to practice self-administration.
And that sounds like a triumph of progressive policy. But it brings us directly to the looming shadow over Collier's legacy. Because while Collier deeply romanticized and believed in the inherent value of communal native life, He was fundamentally a man of the progressive era.
Meaning what, exactly, in this context?
Meaning progressive era reformers possessed an absolute unshakable faith in the supremacy of Western science and centralized federal expertise.
Wait, I need to reconcile this. Collier sounds like a visionary reformer here. He spent his political capital ending allotment. He pushed through the IRA to promote self-government. He fought the army to ensure local infrastructure control. How does this exact same guy become the architect of disaster in the next chapter of our deep dive? Was his respect for native sovereignty entirely conditional? Like, did he only support their autonomy as long as they agreed with the math his scientists were doing?
That is the exact trap of paternalism he set for himself, and it collided violently with reality on the Navajo Nation. We have to take a sharp turn here, moving from the cooperative, negotiated conservation of the CCC-ID to the forced, traumatic conservation imposed on the Navajo.
To understand this trauma, we have to spend significant time examining the crisis of the range, because the conflict was rooted in two entirely different ways of understanding the Earth. In the early 1930s, the BIA and federal scientists conducted extensive range surveys across the Navajo Reservation in the Southwest, and the math they produced terrified them.
They judged the reservation to be catastrophically overgrazed.
Right.
The federal agronomists utilized a specific metric called a sheep unit to calculate the ecological impact of grazing. A sheep unit is a standardized mathematical value. A sheep or a goat equals 1 unit. A cow might equal 4 units because it eats more and is heavier. A horse might equal 5 units.
Okay, got it.
The federal scientists surveyed the fragile, drought-stricken Navajo rangeland and calculated that it had a safe maximum carrying capacity of roughly 500,000 sheep units.
But when they counted the actual herds living on the reservation, they estimated there were perhaps 1 million+ sheep units. By the rigid mathematical models of the federal government, the Navajo possessed more than double the livestock that the ecosystem could biologically support.
And we must connect this local overgrazing to the broader federal infrastructure of the era. This wasn't just about saving Navajo land.
No, it was about protecting a massive federal investment downstream.
Exactly. The government had just built the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. The BIA and federal engineers were absolutely terrified that the massive erosion on the overgrazed Navajo reservation was going to send millions of tons of silt washing down the Colorado River watershed, effectively clogging and ruining the Hoover Dam.
So to the federal government, this was an existential, multi-state environmental and economic crisis that required immediate, drastic intervention. And John Collier, the very man who championed tribal self-government in the IRA, looked at the scientific data, looked at the threat to the Hoover Dam, and made a brutal, unilateral decision.
He deployed the full paternalistic weight of the federal government. Between 1934 and 1944, the BIA initiated a relentless program to buy, seize, and slaughter more than half of the Navajo livestock.
Just shocking.
They forcibly reduced the herds to force the reality on the ground to match the 500,000 sheep unit quota dictated by their mathematical models.
We have to explore the exact cultural and economic mechanism of what this meant for the Navajo, because it wasn't just a loss of agricultural product. The herds weren't just a business. Sheep were the absolute foundation of Navajo wealth, status, and daily survival. A flock of sheep functioned as a mobile bank account.
And the mechanism of this wealth was deeply ingrained in the social fabric, particularly for Navajo women who traditionally owned and managed the flocks. The sheep provided continuous sustenance.
Right.
You shear them for wool, which is spun and woven into rugs that can be traded for external goods. You eat them when necessary. You pass them down to your children as generational wealth.
So when federal agents arrived, seized the animals, and in many cases simply shot them and left them to rot in the canyons because they couldn't be logistically transported to market.
Which happened quite often.
They weren't just killing livestock. They were wiping out the bank accounts, the status, and the spiritual currency of entire families.
The conflict was rooted in a profound clash of epistemologies. The Navajo possessed generations of localized tribal knowledge regarding rainfall patterns, specific canyon microclimates, and rotational grazing that had sustained them in that exact desert environment for centuries.
Right. They knew the land better than anyone.
Exactly. But the federal agronomists arrived with standardized mathematical formulas developed in universities back east. When the localized knowledge conflicted with the centralized math, Collier chose the math, and he enforced it with state violence.
It's like a forester deciding that the only mathematical way to save a forest from a high risk of burning down is to preemptively clear-cut the entire valley. By the math on the clipboard, the fire risk is reduced to 0.
But functionally, you've completely destroyed the exact living ecosystem you were ostensibly trying to protect.
Right, because you treated the trees as abstract fuel load statistics instead of a complex living habitat.
That is exactly what happened. The federal government treated the Navajo economy as an abstract math problem to be solved for the benefit of downstream infrastructure. To John Collier, this was pure scientific conservation.
He thought he was doing the right thing.
He really did. It was driven by the exact same erosion control logic that was driving the immensely popular CCC-ID projects. He genuinely believed he was saving the Navajo land from turning into an uninhabitable desert.
But to the Navajo people, it was an economic and cultural apocalypse.
Yeah.
It was a trauma so profound that Navajo oral history often equates the livestock reduction to a second long walk.
Which is an incredibly heavy comparison.
Just to give some context, the first long walk was the horrific forced deportation and ethnic cleansing of the Navajo by the U.S. military in the 1860s. For the community to create a 1930s conservation policy to a literal ethnic cleansing demonstrates how deeply and irreparably this policy wounded them.
So we are forced to synthesize the ultimate paradox of John Collier and the Indian New Deal. On one hand, you have the men who fought the established bureaucracy of the Army to give Native reservations unprecedented self-governance, family stability, and economic relief through the CCC Indian Division.
And on the other hand, you have the man who devastated the livelihood of the Navajo Nation.
Exactly. And the terrifying part is that both of these extreme outcomes stemmed from the exact same root.
Which was?
It was Collier's unwavering conviction that Washington, equipped with modern progressive science, ultimately knew what the land and the people needed better than the people themselves.
So when Native desires naturally aligned with federal science, you got the empowerment of the CCC-ID. But the second they conflicted, the mask of autonomy slipped, and you got the violence of the livestock reduction.
The autonomy was always conditional. And moving from the specific trauma of the Navajo reduction, we have to pull back to evaluate the entire era. Making sense of this history requires us to reconcile the good, the bad, and even the basic contested facts of the historical record itself.
Let's address those contested facts, because there is a fascinating historical quirk in our sources regarding the basic data of the CCC-ID. If I ask a very simple question like, how many Native men actually participated in the Indian Division over its 9-year lifespan? You would think the federal government would have a precise receipt for this, but the numbers in the historical summaries are completely fractured.
The dispute in the data highlights the chaotic nature of federal record-keeping during the massive rapid rollout of New Deal relief.
The BIA's own contemporary estimates stated that over 30,000 Native men were employed in just the first 3 years, from 1933 to 1936. And most modern historical sources put the lifetime estimate over the program's existence until it was shut down during World War II, somewhere between 80,000 and 85,000 participants.
Right.
But the dossier notes that at least one historical summary claims only 15,000 men served in total. How does a federal bureaucracy lose track of 65,000 people in the paperwork?
It comes down to the mechanism of the counting itself. What exactly is the statistician measuring? The drastically lower number of 15,000 most likely represents the peak enrollment capacity at any single given moment.
But like concurrently.
Right. The BIA might have only had the congressional funding to employ 15,000 men simultaneously in a given month. The higher number of 80,000 to 85,000 represents cumulative enrollments over a decade.
But even with cumulative enrollments, the localized nature of the CCC-ID makes tracking a nightmare. If a man enrolls, works on a dam for 6 months, goes back to tending his own farm for a year, and then re-enrolls 2 years later to build a road, is he counted as one unique individual or two separate enrollments?
Exactly. The incredible flexibility that made the program so successful for family stability, the very fact that they weren't locked into military barracks for fixed terms, made it incredibly difficult for federal statisticians to track them using rigid Army metrics.
Regardless of the exact statistical count, the qualitative impact is undeniable. If I were summarizing these complex events for a student of history, trying to distill the essence of federal Indian policy during the New Deal, I would center on this specific thesis. The CCC-ID and the broader Collier era represent a period of agency and constraint held together.
That's a really solid thesis.
We'll walk a student through that. What does agency and constraint held together look like in practice?
Well, the agency is the undeniable relief. The program provided vital, life-saving wages during a decade of profound starvation. It built enduring, highly specific infrastructure that stabilized the land and supported local economies. It allowed elders to maintain their dignity, and it kept families physically together. That is genuine empowerment.
And the constraint.
The constraint is the realization that this entire ecosystem of relief occurred strictly bounded by the logic, the funding, and the ultimate authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The federal government bent toward the people it served, but it never dropped the reins of power.
So we have to ask the ultimate question regarding the legacy of this era. Did the CCC Indian Division actually support the long-term goal of tribal self-administration? Did these federal policies foster sustainable development for future tribal prosperity?
It remains a subject of intense historical debate, and the answer is a profound yes and no. Yes, absolutely, it fostered development. By placing the management of the workforce and the selection of projects into the hands of tribal councils, the BIA forced those councils to develop vital muscles in modern bureaucratic administration.
Real-world practice.
Right. It trained a generation of Native men in durable industrial and agricultural skills that survived long after the program ended. The physical infrastructure they built became the literal foundation for future economic development on the reservations.
But on the other hand, no, it didn't create true independent self-administration, because the ultimate sovereignty never transferred. The tragedy of the Navajo livestock reduction is the devastating proof of that constraint.
It is the glaring counterexample.
As long as the funding originates in Congress and the overarching policy framework is dictated by a commissioner sitting in a Washington, D.C. office, any local autonomy is fundamentally precarious. It can be revoked the exact moment a federal scientist decides they know better than the local community.
And that is the enduring lesson of the entire Indian New Deal. The CCC-ID was an extraordinary, highly successful experiment in cooperative relief. It was infinitely more humane and adaptable than the standard model. But it remained an instrument of federal policy, forever subject to the inherent paternalism of a system where headquarters still holds the purse strings.
It forces you to completely reevaluate how we view government assistance, the tension between centralized efficiency and local knowledge, and the very definition of conservation. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex journey through a widely misunderstood chapter of the New Deal. It's a powerful reminder that history rarely fits neatly into good or bad boxes.
As we close, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that extends far beyond the 1930s. Think about the massive infrastructure we rely on today and the massive federal investments currently underway, like the expansion of rural broadband, the building of new green energy grids across the country.
We're seeing it happen right now.
We still struggle with the exact same tension that John Collier faced. When the funding and the scientific mandates come from a distant capital, but the physical, economic, and cultural consequences of the construction are lived locally, can true sustainable development ever happen? Or is funded autonomy always just an illusion, waiting for headquarters to change the math?
That is a heavy question to carry with you. You might get to choose the color of the paint and hire the local painters, but as long as headquarters owns the building, the threat of eviction is always there. Thank you so much for listening. We encourage you to look around your own local landscapes, the parks, the roads, the earth-filled dams, and look for the complex, invisible histories built into them. Until next time, keep diving deep.